I guess every father everywhere, as he sees his newborn son for the first time, has the same thought. I want you to have a good life. I want to make your life a good life. I want to try as hard as I can to be the best father I can possibly be. For author Calvin Hennick, it was particularly difficult given his own background. Calvin Hennick is the author of Once More to the Rodeo, and he reads an excerpt from his book.
Day one. I can't even get us out the door right. The road trip has been planned for months. Every night at bedtime, my 5-year-old son Niall has told me how he's going to fall asleep and dream about all the fun we'll have on our way to Iowa, all the motel pools we'll swim in, all the treats we'll eat, all the games we'll play. But now that the rental car is parked in the driveway, I'm rummaging through drawers, randomly tossing socks and wrinkled t-shirts into my luggage, and I can hear Niall downstairs pouting about how he doesn't want to leave his mother and little sister behind. It's late afternoon in late July, and sweat trickles down my back and pools in my boxer briefs as I struggle to zip up my suitcase. It's nearly 4 o'clock, and I want to get us on the road before the worst of Boston's evening rush hour hits. Oh, I hear Niall moan from his playroom. It's not fair. You're fine, I call down to him, starting down the stairs with my bag. We're going to have fun, remember? Niall answers in a low, despondent voice. I just wish I could stay here with Mommy. Tough luck, I mutter to myself. My expectations for this trip are impossibly high. We'll be on the road for 10 days, headed toward the annual rodeo in my tiny hometown of Maxwell, Iowa. Niall starts kindergarten in a few weeks, and as absurd as it sounds to say out loud, I have the feeling that I'm sending him out into the world for the first time, that the protective bubble I've placed around him his entire life is beginning to pop. Niall is already becoming the man he's going to be, and while this is exciting to watch, it's also scary. As his father, I'm in charge of teaching him how to be a man, and although I think I'm doing okay so far, I'm also largely making up things as I go. The way I see it, I face 3 big obstacles. First, I have no relationship with my own father and grew up with very little in the way of positive male role models. Second, I think that societal expectations of men are changing rapidly in ways that we mostly aren't talking about yet. And third, Niall is a brown boy in a world where that still very much matters, and I have nothing to teach him about how to be a Black man in America. For me, this trip is a quest, and although my goal feels unrealistic, it is also crystal clear. I want to figure out for myself what it means to be a good man right now, and what it means to raise one.
Calvin Hennick reading an excerpt from his memoir, Once More to the Rodeo. Calvin, thank you very much for joining us. It's a wonderful book. I look forward to talking to you about it.
Thanks a lot, Pete. Thanks for having me on.
Now, you mentioned that when you were a boy, you liked to write stories. At what point in your life did you consider writing for a living?
It's something I always wanted to do, really. In college, I didn't major in journalism, but I majored in English, and I worked at this school paper, and I applied for, I think, 40 big internships after my junior year of college and struck out across the board. And I thought maybe that wasn't realistic. So I went into teaching for a couple of years, saved up some money, just enough to float myself to freelance for a few months and kind of stuck with it. And eventually I went on to, get a master's degree in creative writing. But I continue to freelance as my day job.
You touched on your academic background, which is outstanding. Your alma mater is the University of Iowa, a school, incidentally, which has produced a number of outstanding writers. You have 2 master's degrees, as I understand it, a master's in science from Pace University and a master's in fine arts from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And you mentioned you grew up in tiny Maxwell, Iowa, spent about 20 years there, and 2 years in Rockport, Massachusetts, where your mom was from. Is that that's true?
Yeah, so I lived with my mom for a couple of years between 3rd and 5th grade, and then I came back to Maxwell, Iowa to live with my grandparents until I graduated from high school.
We should underscore something you said a moment ago as you were reading. The book, as you read, opens with you and Niall getting ready for this grand adventure. And you had planned this for some time. Could you talk about why you felt you had to do this and why you had to do it just before he entered kindergarten?
I mean, part of it was what I just read about that sort of irrational sense of sending him out into the world. I think most parents can relate to the idea that every year goes by, you have just slightly less and less control over your child's world. Like, even if you still have a great relationship with them, and even if they still listen to you, they're getting more messages from more people. They're hearing from peers, they're hearing from teachers. And so I felt like this was sort of a ripe opportunity to sort of meditate on these issues that we're going to impact the next decade plus of raising him to be a man.
We should talk a little bit about your family, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You are married to your wife, Belzy, who you met when you were going through training for Teach for America at age 22. You were in New York City. You were ready to be a man on the town, but not when Belzy came along, I guess.
Yep, still with her.
3 years later, you married her, and still with her indeed. You're a lucky man. And your offspring are not only Niall, but your daughter Eloise, who everybody calls Peanut. When you and Belzy first started dating, did you have any conversations about the possibility of bringing children of color into the world?
I'm not sure if when we first started dating, and we were 22 when we met, so we weren't really thinking about kids yet. But we talked about race, and I don't know. I think my eyes have been opened to the past few years that perhaps we weren't as far along as maybe I thought we were when we met. And not we as a couple, I mean, we as a society, right? That we've seen a real dark side, a real ugly side of, nationalism and nativism sort of rear its head again these past few years, which has been surprising to me. And so, perhaps I was naive, or perhaps America did sort of a good job of hiding who it was for a while. But, I sort of, I came up in the 80s and 90s when I think, it was in vogue for white people to view themselves as sort of colorblind. I see everybody equally, that sort of thing. And I think a lot of people have sort of come to an understanding that actually that's not ideal, that, differences are important, and it's important to understand where other people are coming from. So, we did talk, about race, but our conversations have evolved as we've sort of seen what's happening in the world.
And now you have these two wonderful children. How are they faring in the world at this point in their lives?
They're good. We talk every year to Niall more honestly about what the world is like, right? So he's a fairly anxious kid, gets some of that from his dad. But we know that he's likely to internalize a lot of things. So if we tell him, hey, this bad incident happened, he's going to immediately say, well, what if this happens to me, and get very upset about it. And so we have to sort of weigh what to tell him and what not to tell him. And so we often err on the side of, telling him, let him be a kid. Don't, put the weight of the world on his shoulders. But there are times when you can't ignore things. So for example, when George Floyd was murdered last summer, we had to sit, both of our kids down and talk to them. And Niall understandably, got very upset, and, we had him draw his feelings. He really likes to draw. The next book I'm working on is actually a graphic novel that I'm working on with him. But last summer he drew his feelings, and he drew, see if I can remember it correctly. It was a police officer with a gun pointing down, and he was pointed with an arrow with the words "killed me" off screen. And it's not like we're trying to plant anti-police ideas or something in his head, or his uncle is a cop, but it's just, he had a lot of difficulty processing that, as I think, I have difficulty processing those types of things when I see what a dark place and unfair and unjust place the world can still be. I get despondent. So, certainly it doesn't surprise me that it's hard for he was 9 last summer, for a 9-year-old to handle those things.
You talked briefly when you read your excerpt about your father and the challenges that he presented in your young life. You write that it's hard to talk about your own family with strangers, and yet you're very frank about that in the book. How difficult was that to write?
Well, what I say it's sort of a joke in the book, that it's not hard for me to, open up. It's hard for me to get the facts straight, because there's so many ins and outs, and divorces and remarriages, and cousins who aren't really my cousins, and aunts who are my aunts but who I haven't seen in decades. So the facts of my life have always sort of just been the facts of my life. And I've never really been that, to explain why I was living with my grandmother, I had to explain the whole story of everything else that had ever happened. And so I was just sort of used to sharing that stuff. So, yeah, it wasn't really difficult for me to open up about that stuff in writing.
You were very frank about your own demons. How difficult was that to write about?
Also, I don't know. I'm just kind of an open guy. Yeah, in the book, I mentioned that I've struggled with alcohol, and I was 3 months sober. I think I mentioned in the narrative of the book, and I'm still riding that same wave of sobriety. So I just crossed 5 years, so that's nice. I always joke that I'll drink again on my next relapse, so I don't have to worry about it.
But there is a temptation that you deal with during the course of the book too, and I think it shows your strength that you didn't.
Well, yeah, there's a moment in the book where just sort of I have this feeling like I sort of acted in a way that I don't think was very emblematic of being a good father. I got really frustrated with Niall over something small and sort of just overreacted. And I think there's almost nothing worse than feeling like a bad parent, right? And so we were in Niagara Falls at the time, and I was driving him back to the hotel, and we were both in this sort of down mood. And I just sort of noticed all the liquor store signs and the beer and wine shops for the first time, because you don't notice them when you're not looking for them. And then all of a sudden it's just sort of, they would haunt me a little bit. But yeah, no, I mean, I was alone with my son, and I knew I was writing the book. I knew if I got drunk that night, I'd have to put it in there.
Good decision.
Yeah.
Was that the time when you had really hoped that you and Niall could share the go-kart track, but Niall wasn't having that? I know you were disappointed about that. These little guys don't come with instruction manuals, but I think every father, including this one, has been through a point where there was something he really, really wanted to share with his son, but his son just didn't feel it. Was that the thing that precipitated your at least getting tempted?
Yeah, I mean, that was that scene where he'd been so interested in automobiles from a really young age, and we went to Niagara Falls specifically to drive go-karts, which sounds silly, but it's one place I knew that they would exist on the kind of route we were traveling west. And so I was so excited to finally do this with him because it was his thing. And I get less invested when it's something about me. Like I mentioned in the book that I collected baseball cards as a kid, and I've gotten actually back into it since I wrote the book. And I've tried taking Niall to some baseball card shows before the pandemic, and he has zero interest, and that's fine with me. I don't really care. But I was so heartbroken that I couldn't give him this experience that I thought he wanted so badly, and with the go karts. And it sounds so silly to even talk about. Oh, I was upset about the go karts, like I'm a 5-year-old, but that was my experience in the moment.
It's happened to things like that have happened to a lot of us.
Sure.
Let's talk baseball for a second. You make an unscheduled stop before you go to Niagara Falls to Cooperstown and the Baseball Hall of Fame, which is a wonderful experience for all of us. I thought it was very interesting that you took Jackie Robinson's breaking of the major league color barrier and made that a teachable moment. But at this point, Niall is 5. He really doesn't understand baseball, nor does he understand baseball's place in American life. That seems a very difficult, maybe a high mountain to climb.
Sure. I mean, it isn't, but it is. But then also, Jackie Robinson is a figure where you can talk about race and racism in a sort of falsely binary way, right? Before there was segregation, and now there's not segregation, and that's sort of how I learned about racism in school. And the unspoken corollary, false corollary, there is before there was racism, and now there's not racism, which obviously isn't accurate, right? So it was a way to introduce Niall into the idea that here's how American history was for a while, and we stopped being like that. But I've had to sort of become more and more nuanced in how I talk to him about things as he gets older, because as we all know, racism didn't stop with the color barrier being broken in baseball, or with desegregation in the South in the 60s, or with the first Black president. Racism is a resilient beast.
Indeed it is. During the course of the trip, you meet up with Belzy and Peanut in Chicago, and as much fun as that must have been, it seemed like it was a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of, I think parents of young kids can relate to this. Once you have the other parent around, you kind of can, you can become a worse parent a little bit, because you're like, all right, you deal with this. And so I let my frustrations boil over a couple more times there too. Yeah, and we were all exhausted too. Poor Niall. I would maybe build in a rest day here or there if I was going to do it over again, because he was really tired.
let's make it clear that it's parents with young kids and parents with old kids that have good memories. We've all been through it. Now, you have the opportunity now to head toward Iowa, but now we'll just as soon go home with his mom at this point, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he again was tired. He'd seen his mom again. It's sort of I think about, this was after the book because he was in kindergarten. I went to school to read to his class one day in the afternoon, and I was the surprise mystery reader. And as soon as he saw me, he kind of latched on. He's, you know, he normally went to after school programs and stuff, but he was coming home with me. Like once he saw his parent, you know, he melted, and I think that's the experience he had with his mom. You know, he like, I want to go home with mommy, but we ended up, you know, having a good time again the rest of the trip.
The book we're talking about is Once More to the Rodeo, and we're meeting the book's fine author, Calvin Hennick. The show is on the bookshelf. I'm Pete Solomon. We continue now to begin to talk about the trip as it moves farther west. You, after leaving Niagara Falls, worked your way through Canada. Could Niall understand the differences between Canada and the United States?
Not really at the time, I don't think. You know, he just sort of knew he was in the car with his dad at that point.
Well, you did tell him there was no New York City in Iowa, too.
Yeah. his the sophistication around geography is really funny in little kids. You know, yeah, is there New York City in Iowa? Those type of questions.
Ultimately, you and Niall reach Iowa. And as you look back, did things work out a little bit better than you thought they might?
How do you mean?
Well, you have some challenging memories from your boyhood and the time that you spent in Iowa and with your family. And yet it seemed like, although nothing is perfect, you were able to see your grandmother, you were able to get together with your other grandmother and
Sure.
Chuck E. Cheese and have some fun. And I'm guessing there might have been a point, maybe planning the trip or on your way to Iowa, where you sort of held your breath and said, I just hope this goes well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of backstory in the book about me being raised by my grandmother, who was, you know, frankly not well equipped to be raising a teenager. And, you know, there's some people have reacted really strongly to those sort of flashback scenes. And for me, again, it was just sort of, oh, this is my life. And you know, other people have had it far worse. And I'm not sort of saying, oh, poor me, but other people have reacted really strongly, especially people that knew me growing up. Like, oh, I didn't know that it was like that for you at home. And then sort of in the book, you see that my grandmother is one of the people in my life that I've forgiven in my family for the things, you know, that she's done. And I haven't forgiven everybody. And sort of, you know, people have asked, and it's sort of in the book, that question of like, well, why her over other people? And part of it was just that she was there. And I think people can relate to that in their own families. The people that you continue to see and have some sort of relationship with, even if it's strained, just, you know, if 80% of success in life is showing up, it might be that 80% of love is showing up too. I don't know. I just thought of that on the spot, so I don't know how profound it is, but there might be something to it.
You talk about people reacting in a negative sort of way, but I think people use as the mirror their own lives.
Sure.
And really can't understand what it was like for you day after day after day to deal with the problems in your boyhood, which is a difficult challenge for any boy, that your grandmother brought along.
Yeah.
So you work your way to Iowa, and one of the things you do is you visit a cemetery and you see your grandfather's grave. And there's a very poignant moment in the book, because there are portions in the book where you talk about trying to explain the concept of death to Niall.
Sure.
And he really finally gets it when you go to the cemetery. Could we elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, that visit was fraught for a couple of reasons. So it was my grandfather's grave, but my grandfather raised me with my grandmother when I was in high school, but they formally adopted me. So technically he was my father. They legally adopted me. And then within months of him adopting me, he hightailed it out of town and moved to Las Vegas with his girlfriend. And so there was this sort of second fatherhood abandonment thing that happened with me. And so this was the first time that I was visiting his grave. I hadn't been speaking to him when he died. And then at the same time, Niall, as I mentioned, you know, has a lot of anxiety about different things. And one of those things is death. And he was just learning, you know, at 5 years old, you were really just sort of learning about the the permanence of death. And he had just watched Charlotte's Web with my grandmother over the weekend, and I thought that that was sort of a good lead into, you know, to his first visit to a cemetery to pay respects to someone in his family.
We should note that you cite E.B. White twice in your book.
Yes, the title comes from an E.B. White essay, lesser known work than Charlotte's Web, but well known among writers, is Once More to the Lake. E.B. White took his young son back to one of his childhood haunts, which was a lake in, I want to say, upstate New York or maybe New England. And during the course of that book, or I'm sorry, that essay, E.B. White sort of reflects on the passage of time and sort of handing the torch from one generation to the next, and sort of sees himself as his own father and sees his son as his childhood self. And I talk about the essay in the book and talk about how it's not quite the same for me and my son. I don't really have that same, for the most of the book, have that same sort of body switch experience, because I feel like his childhood and my childhood are so different. And one of those things is that he has a father and I didn't, for example.
Yeah. We talked a moment ago about how you've written that it's difficult to talk to strangers about your family. And I certainly don't want to pull a scab off a wound, but you and your lack of a relationship with your father is a big component of your book. Could we talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I experienced my father in different ways depending on the day. So, you know, while I was writing about the book, I thought about my father a lot, but at other times I'll go weeks or maybe even months without even really remembering that I have a father, if that's not a strange thing to say, because he's so little a part of my life. And in the book, I kind of have to come to terms with my anger about my dad and sort of decide how big of a role that is going to play in my life and how much I'm going to hold on to it and how little I'm going to hold on to it. And I come to what I feel like is sort of a surprising answer, because I feel like with these father-son stories, we're so used to these redemptive arcs, and, you know, people coming together in ways that often feel really false to me. You know, I don't think it's okay, now that I'm a father, especially, I don't think it's okay for a father to be a terrible father the entire time a child is growing up, and then sort of show up once the kid is 18 or 30 or 40 and say, all right, I'm back. And then there's a hug and, you know, cue the music. That's not my experience of life.
So is it fair to say that your childhood was a very difficult one and not particularly happy?
I mean, I think so. I mean, part of that is just I wasn't that good at being a kid. You know what I mean? Like, that's a weird thing to say, but like, it's not all external. Some kids are, you know, I have two children, and Niall, as I mentioned, is a little bit more anxious. And my daughter is just very happy-go-lucky, but they both have the exact same experiences and they both have the exact same amount of love in their homes. And so part of it is, I wasn't the most popular kid on the playground. So, you know, it wasn't really, I wasn't great at baseball or something like that. There wasn't a refuge for me.
Well, maybe you weren't, but at the same time, when you reach Maxwell, Iowa, you will run into a lot of people you grew up with, went to school with. Some of your friends married others of your friends and
Sure.
have their own families now. And that part of the trip seems to go pretty well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I still feel like Iowa is home in a way, although again, the past few years have made me less and less nostalgic for it. Seeing what I mean, I don't I a lot of my friends on social media still live in Iowa, so I learn a little bit about, you know, how they handled the pandemic, or how they've handled recent elections, or what elected officials are saying there. And it hasn't been, you know, it's that one thing that didn't make it into the book because I just didn't find a place for it. It's not because I was trying to hide it or anything, but I was at the town, you know, the annual town carnival and rodeo in Maxwell, and I was using one of the porta potties, and someone had written, this was in the summer of 2016, someone had written in black Sharpie on the inside of the facility, Trump 2016 beaners. So they used, you know, a racial slur to, you know, which for me is both horrifying, but also perfect in a way, because I feel like it was unspoken for so many people that racial resentment, or just racism is the real word for it, was the reason that they were supporting that particular candidate. And it's, you know, I think if you're going to support someone because they're racist, say it.
Well, and that makes you racist. So,
yes. Yeah, exactly.
I understand. But you interact with people that you might not have been that close to when you were a kid.
Yeah.
But it seems like going to the rodeo was a fun experience for you, although you mentioned it was a little smaller than when you were a kid.
Yeah, it's sort of, Maxwell is an 800, maybe 900 person town now. And, even when I was growing up, you would hear stories about its heyday when there was a bowling alley and a movie theater and everything. And I think every small town had its own kind of, was able to sustain its own little mini community. And now, those towns are more farming communities and sort of bedroom communities for bigger towns. And sort of every time a school bond issue comes up, it's sort of like the town crosses its fingers, because if they aren't able to keep the schools up, they're going to have to close down the schools. The kids will be bused somewhere else, and the town will just be dead.
Calvin, you are one of a number of writers we've talked to who thanks Grub Street, the writers group,
Sure.
for your success. In a couple of words, could you explain what it meant to the process of writing this book that has been successful itself?
Yeah, so Grub Street is, for people who don't know, an independent writing center in Boston. It was downtown, and I believe it's already moved to the Seaport District. During the pandemic, they moved. I've taught there and I've taken classes there, and I've just really always been really wowed by both the talent of the students and then the dedication of the instructors. So I worked on pieces of this book in classes at Grub Street, and then also my writing group is made up of mostly former now Grub Street instructors, and so they were looking at parts of it too.
Can you put into perspective what the honor of winning the Pushcart Press Editor's Book Award means to you?
That was a big deal for me. So the book initially struck out with big publishers, and I eventually went out to small presses. And I was shocked when Bill Henderson, who founded Pushcart Press and the Pushcart Prizes, called me up and told me he was awarding me, the book, the Editor's Book Award, and it was going to be published because Pushcart it's a small house, but it's a big name, and Bill has really built up.
He's sort of the Babe Ruth of publishing in this area, right?
Yeah, he's really
I don't mean geographically. I mean in terms of getting good works that sometimes are passed over, published, and making them successful.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so he's a giant in the field, really. And I was, thrilled to hear from him. And then I went to New York to the sales meeting, and sort of, we met him, and we went out for drinks afterward at the Algonquin, which is a, big former, writing haven. And he was telling me stories about, my favorite story he told me was how originally he had some, ridiculously long title. It was going to be like the Pushcart Anthology of Contemporary Fiction or something like that. And it was Raymond Carver's editor who was like, no, just call it the Pushcart Prize. And so that's perfect, because Carver is so known for his minimalism. And then to have even the title of the press be shortened.
What did the success of Once More to the Rodeo mean to your future as a writer?
I don't know. It was really, gratifying to get noticed. Amazon named it one of the best books of the year. It was named a new and notable selection of the New York Times, and there were some other nice things. The Boston Globe magazine ran an excerpt and put me and my son on the cover, actually. So that was really surprising for what was, essentially a really small book. It was a small press book, and I wasn't expecting that type of attention. That said, it's not like it's on the New York Times bestseller list. I'm still an unagented author. I'm still kind of working in obscurity on my own stuff. As I mentioned, my next project that I'm working on right now, I'm doing some other projects on my own, including some fiction. But Niall and I are working together on a graphic novel. He's an extremely talented artist, and we're having a lot of fun on it. And if my first book had been a 7-figure advanced bestseller, I don't feel like I might have the freedom to spend 10 hours a week working on a graphic novel with a 10-year-old. So I in a way feel like I have the best of both worlds. I really was really gratified by the reception for the book, but there's something to be said for kind of still having some freedom in the shadows a little bit.
Calvin Hennick, we hope that you and your co-author have nothing but great things ahead of them, along with your daughter and your wife. We certainly appreciate the visit. It was great fun to meet you, and best wishes for continued success.
Thanks so much, Pete.
Thank you. The book is Once More to the Rodeo. Its author, Calvin Hennick. Thank you very much for joining us, Calvin. This is On the Bookshelf. I'm Pete Solomon. See you next time.